Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Hello, listeners. Welcome back. I am with Kathryn Valentine, and so excited to talk with her about her work. She is founder of Worthmore Strategies, a consulting firm focused on achieving gender parity in the workplace by empowering women to ask for what they need to thrive in their careers. She's been featured in Fast Company, Adweek, Working Mother, Forbes, and Business Insider. Since 2015, she has served several hundreds of individual women in the workplace in the form of negotiations. In 2020, a multinational bank approached her for leveraging her research to increase retention of female VPs. And last year, Worthmore piloted this program across 4 different industries and saw a 50% decrease in attrition as a result. She graduated from University of Virginia, started her career at McKinsey, and has an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management. And while in business school, in fact, she researched how to negotiate specifically as a woman. That work is the foundation of her research-based approach to women's leadership. And she lives in Atlanta with her husband and 2 sons and enjoys running, reading, and burns everything she tries to cook. I love that, Kathryn. Welcome to the show.
Julie, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to come chat with you.
Yeah, of course. Well, I'm so curious in the work you do with women in negotiations. Sounds like you had your own personal experience, and oftentimes it is our own personal experience that brings us into this work. Tell us about your own personal experience and how that parlayed into you starting to do this work for a living.
I love to really dive in that way. So I feel like that story is always, to your point, a little bit. It's still not an easy story to tell, right? So in 2014, I was getting my MBA. I was very, I think, continue to be very career oriented, and I did an MBA internship. And as an MBA student, as you know, like the goal of the internship is to get the job. And they gave me an assignment over the summer. I finished that summer-long assignment in 2 weeks. And I was really excited because I was like, great, this will give me an opportunity to hopefully join a different team. And then I'll have twice as many people who are exposed to my work and hopefully twice as many voices that would be able to vote for me at the end of the summer so that I could get that job that I really wanted. And so I spent all weekend, hours and hours and hours Googling how to negotiate, how to have this discussion. And went in on Monday morning. I'd scripted out everything I was going to say. Went in on Monday morning, and within 10 minutes, I had gone from a top candidate to not even in the game anymore. It was very clear that I was not going to get a full-time position after that conversation. And as a result of that, then the dreaded F word came, right? I just don't think you're a fit for our culture. So I walked into that room excited to position myself to get this job at the end of the summer. And I walked out of that room, not only without a job, but without an internship. And actually, per company protocol, the security guard then escorted me out of the building with my box of things. And so I spent the next year as a business school student trying to figure out what had happened in that room. And what I discovered after going in, I went through probably 70 or 80, very dense research, academic studies and reports. And what I ended up realizing is 3 things. 1, negotiation is gendered. So what my brother can do is different from what I can do. And most of the information that's out there, like everything that I Googled, is directed towards men, but it doesn't really come without warning, right? So number 1, negotiations is gendered. Number 2, there's a solution, right? As a professional woman, there are so many situations we're up against where it's very nebulous and the right thing to do is hard to get your arms around. In this one case, there is a research proven solution that has been around for almost 10 years. It came out of Harvard, was validated at Georgetown and Columbia. And it's very well known in the academic circles, but it's not really connected to the women who could use it. So that was my third discovery, is that the researchers know what the solution to this problem is, but we hadn't done as good of a job connecting it to the people that needed it. So it was, in a weird way, nice to know that it wasn't just me. There wasn't anything wrong with me. It's that this was one of those situations where gender and the workplace really, there's a lot of inherent friction. But it was great to know that there's a way forward. It's actually pretty easy.
Well, I don't love your own personal story. Unfortunately, that's a sad reality. Like, oh, you spoke up, you negotiated,
And they
shame
kicked
on
you out of the building.
Yeah. Like, wow, you're not a good fit. Get out of here. It's like, what? You just finished a summer internship project on like record speed. That seems like a really weird reaction to positive performance. But I think it speaks to the overall broader experience that unfortunately a lot of women have in the workplace, where if you speak up, if you ask for something, if you negotiate, you're stepping out of that gender socialized boundary, that category that we all have in our brains that women should be pleasing, don't ask for too much, make everyone else happy, not yourself. And then you're labeled words like aggressive and difficult. And, I remember my own personal story, Kathryn, very similar. I didn't get walked out of the building, but I negotiated like we were taught in business school. I did 2 negotiation classes. Like, I'm going to negotiate my offer 100% out of business school. And I remember asking for more money, or I think we kind of traded off some benefits and things. Like, I know as you teach in your classes, it doesn't have to be just money and it's not a finite game. But I remember speaking up and asking, and they did give me a little bit more, in the negotiation, but then being like shamed publicly in front of my team, the HR person, who was a woman, said, "Can you believe Julie actually negotiated?" And I looked at her, I was like, "Yeah." And like all the dudes in the room were like, "Hell yeah." Like, I would. And the women were kind of like confused. It was such a weird. And until then, I didn't know it was a thing. And I was like, was I not supposed to? Like, everybody told me I was supposed to. But then when you do, you get this like weird reaction. They're not really supposed to. So I'm curious, Kathryn, like, what is your take on that? I know you teach women how to negotiate. What happens when they do and it doesn't go well?
Well, the thing that what I was taking out of your story is also how much we don't talk about how this is such a gendered area, right? Like, you're surprised. Well, I thought that was what I was like, you're surprised. I mean, even the best business schools teach non-gendered negotiation, because when we're negotiating on behalf of a company or a team or others, there actually gender doesn't come into play, because it plays towards the other focused piece. It's only really when we're negotiating on behalf of ourselves in a highly gendered context that this really ignites backlash. And so what we're seeing is, women are suffering from backlash, and I would call what you experienced a form of that. When we negotiate kind of traditional things like compensation or promotions, things like that. Men actually suffer from backlash at higher rates when they negotiate flexibility. So non-gender conforming situations for them, which, if we can't have men negotiating flexibility to be with their families more because now they have, working partners and whatever it is, that, we're also not, we have to push the boundaries there too.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's another form of gendered discrimination. Like, women asking for flexibility is almost expected or sometimes presumed before even women
which is a problem in of itself. Yeah.
Right. It's like, okay, we'll give you more flexibility. Like, if you be quiet and, do your job and don't ask for more money. It's like, well, that's not what every woman wants. Not every woman.
Yeah.
A lot of women are the breadwinner. And I am curious, Kathryn, when you go, and I know you go into organizations and you teach some of these proven methods that you said have been well researched in the academic world, which I also find in DEI space, there's tons of academic research that doesn't percolate into the corporate world where people could actually apply it.
Yes.
Which seems so odd and so strange that these spheres are so separate. But as somebody that's translating that and bridging that gap, what are the principles you would recommend to folks that are like, I think I need to negotiate, but I'm not sure what to do?
Yeah. So I love that question. The first step is identifying your interest, right? Even when we look at like gender parity in the workplace, that assumes one definition of success, which is that we all want to be at the tip top of the organization. And maybe we do, and maybe we don't. That shouldn't be a gendered thing. But I think, number one is, what is your interest? I worked with somebody who on their bucket list was doing an Ironman. I shouldn't say running, biking, swimming. And so that interest was like, yeah, I'm happy to hang where I am right now professionally for a little bit, because this is like this big thing I want to do before I die. Right. So step number one is understanding what your interest is. Step number 2 is thinking holistically. So this is what you alluded to earlier, which is that negotiation isn't just compensation, right? It is the hours you work, where you work from, what projects you work on, the people you work with, the accounts you get to work on, how you're compensated, and also any additional learning, any additional support, anything really that can increase your impact or decrease your stress, are all within the realms of things to negotiate. And then the third part is ask communally. This is the relational ask that totally changed my life. And that's a lot of what we spend time on in the course. And then that last piece is negotiate collaboratively, which is what we learned in business school, right? It's that we assume that this is a win-lose situation, but particularly when you're an employee negotiating with your employer, the overlap of win-win is so much larger than we think it is, right? I'm an employee. Anything that I can ask for that helps me deliver more or decreases my risk of burnout is actually good for both of us. And I think once we can frame it there and it becomes an us versus the problem, then like we're really set up to succeed in those discussions.
Yeah, I love those tips. I love that process. And start with identifying, what do you want? What do you really want? And broaden it. Think about those win-win opportunities. And I was reminded, like, the best negotiators oftentimes listen more than they speak, as they're pulling out like the needs of the other party, or getting clues on how what they want could match what the other person wants. I'm curious, I know you spend a lot of time with women in particular, teaching them how to negotiate in an organization, which seems a little ironic, because I think for organizations, they're like, oh, shoot, she's going to ask for more money or flexibility or something, that they're paying you to come in, teach them to negotiate. Why? Why did they pay you to come in and talk about that?
So I have to say, this was not an intentional thing, right? I was working with individual employees, and I was noticing that, they were coming to me when they were negotiating a new job offer. So they were leaving an employer. And what I realized is, when the conversation turned to why they were leaving, the vast majority of the reasons they were leaving were negotiable. They just weren't they just didn't have the tools really to negotiate them, right? And that's what we try and build up. What happened was, one company reached out and said, hey, I think that this will help with our retention. And what we find, and it's, I think like many things, it's so simple when you say it out loud, right? But women know what they need to thrive. It's just that the cost to asking for those things is infinitely higher for our gender because of the risk of backlash, which means that we're not having the conversations. When we can lower that cost, we can have those conversations more often, which means that companies are able to pick up hidden value all over. Right. We see not only productivity gains, about 13%, we see almost twice as many women staying. We see more promotions. We also see, frankly, that people are just more engaged and happier in their everyday life. And frankly, based on the sort of labor force dynamics right now, we know that it costs 2 to 3 times as much to replace somebody as it does to retain them. And that could take 12 months at this point in time. Right. And in many cases, the negotiations we do ends up being around non-compensation things. But in the cases that they are compensation things, you would much rather pay an employee an additional X% than have to replace somebody.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love it as a retention strategy. And you have that backing from pre and post when you've worked with organizations to support a lower attrition rate, which is a great outcome, I think, to measure from training. And yeah, I think so many times, again, because of how women are socialized, we are not naturally this way, but we're socialized from a very young age to please others, put people ahead of us. And so then that really does backfire in something like a negotiation, because not only do you have the gender bias that you get confronted with, but you have your own personal, like, harboring, tabling all these issues, when if you just spoken up and shared out the organization, it's probably doable. It's probably very reasonable. But now you think you have to leave to get what you want.
Well, but also speaking up in a way that feels, I mean, the number one reason why women don't negotiate is this risk of backlash, which we can talk about, right? It's much higher for women, and it looks different than it did 30 years ago. But the other reason I hear women don't negotiate is because it doesn't feel authentic to who they are.
Exactly.
It's not an area they're interested. They don't want to sacrifice their values, right? And so giving people an alternative way to have that conversation that actually is sort of a win-win for both. Now we can talk about what we can do for teams when people are really able to get what they need to be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I mean, I think that's kind of how I felt. I remember a couple of personal experiences is striking a chord with my first job out of college, undergrad. All the men that I worked with, there's 6 of us in the leadership development program, and
Mm-hmm.
5 dudes, me, all of them negotiated, and I was the least paid person right at the get-go. But me thinking like, oh my gosh, I'm getting paid a lot more money than I thought I was going to get paid, and a lot more money than my friends that are graduating. I don't want to be greedy and ask for more, but
Yeah.
they had no problem. And it
Yeah.
was only a few $1,000s, but again, that compounds over the course of your
Mm-hmm.
career. And then fast forward to my last job in corporate, I remember coming back from leave. It was not maternity leave because they didn't pay for that. It was short-term disability leave. So just like call it what it was. But 5 weeks, off, and, come back and not loving my job before, and they'd actually eliminated it anyway. And so I went to the COO and I was like, hey, I think this is the job I want to do, and kind of created my own job description. Yes or no? They're like, yeah, give it a whirl, like see if it works. And, because I had the wherewithal was put in a circumstance, but also knew that I needed more purposeful work and to speak up and ask for it, they got another year out of me, and it ultimately led to me starting my own business, which was terrific for me too, that I got to get more experience in a safer corporate setting for
Mm-hmm.
starting my business. So, back to that win-win and finding the thing that you really want and dialing into that in the conversation, I think is so important, Kathryn.
Well, and Julie, what that reminded me of is I worked with this woman. I'm going to call her Susan, but I worked with this woman, Susan. So I do this talk called the Empower Hour. It's like 45 minutes and then Q&A. So I gave this talk at a financial institution, and I got a LinkedIn message afterwards from, again, Susan, who basically said, when I walked into that talk, I was on my way out. I was literally had my resignation written, was going to turn it in that day. And what I realized from your talk is that I love my company. I've been here 10 years. I love it. I love the people I work with. I love the work. But what happened, and for her, it had been almost a year previously, is somebody on the team had gone out on maternity leave, and her boss had said, hey, can you cover this job just while she's out? And Susan was like, and in that moment, I was so proud that I was such a high achiever that I could actually do 2 jobs for 3 months. She was like, but then we went through a merger, and that person came back. That job was eliminated, right? She was moved to another team. And all of a sudden, I'm still doing 2 jobs with no recognition, no resourcing, no additional compensation. But I didn't know how to say it. And so instead, she was like, I felt undervalued by the company. I started looking externally. After this talk, I went to my manager and I said, hey, I don't know if you realize that this is what's happening. And her manager was like, embarrassed because so many things had been happening. We know how busy our managers are, right? So many things have been flying around that she had actually missed this temporary assignment that didn't go into the HR system. So within a week, Susan got a promotion, somebody on her team, and a 40%, increase in comp, which was commensurate with what she was actually doing. And the company got to keep somebody who clearly was a great performer, but they wouldn't have if she didn't know how to have that conversation.
Yeah. Isn't it amazing? You're like, how did they not know that this was happening?
I ask myself that all the time. How do they not know? And then frankly, I look, and I'm sure it's the same with you. And then you look at your inbox and you're like, whoa, that's how people are missing things.
Yeah. And people are focused on themselves and their own careers. Even the best managers can be a bit egotistical and not worried. And if the work's getting done and there's no problems, then you don't really pay attention to it. You're playing whack-a-mole on other problems. So I appreciate that story, because there's so many Susans out there that I think just that resonates with you. Like if you feel burnout, which we know is an extremely high rate nowadays, especially of women, and the exodus of women in the workforce. I mean, I think for organizations looking at your attrition numbers, they're starkly gendered. We're losing a lot more women than we are men right now. And why is that? Right. And I think a lot of the things that you're talking about are reasons why. That women aren't speaking up before it's too late. And then they're so burnout, they're leaving because they don't feel like they have a choice. And what if we could create an environment where there's choice, there's conversation, and that costly turnover, that's got to hurt your bottom line.
Well, and with women graduating, now with more degrees and all those other things, like we have to, it's so funny when I talk to people about, when I talk to people about their women's initiatives, a lot of times they like to talk about recruiting, and that's fantastic, right? But what we're doing there is we're just pouring more water into a bucket that has holes. I really like to talk about plugging those holes so that we're keeping those highly talented women, which we know actually in and of itself then attracts more women. So it actually, your recruiting then leverages off of your retention. So anyway, I agree with you. It's a problem that it's exciting to think about how to solve.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it solves a lot of business problems by tackling this problem. I wonder, in the work you do, and whenever I do anything focused on women, which I don't do as much anymore, it's more broader DEI work that I get to do, which I'm thankful for. But there is a specific gendered experience that women have in the workplace. I'm curious what the reaction of men has been. Sometimes I hear things like, why do women need this special thing? Or why do we need to fix women? These types of weird reactions I get. I'm curious, like, what you hear and what you would want them to think.
I have been blown away by the genuine desire of most of all the men I've encountered, honestly, to solve this problem. I was at a sales training a couple weeks ago, and an older white man from middle America manufacturing walked up to me, and he was like, "Can you tell me more about this?" And I think honestly, he had a daughter. She was just entering the workforce. And we see this, right? We see that men with daughters become some of the strongest allies for this movement, because he's been telling her for 23 years that she can be anything she wants to be. And then he looks into her experience and his own organization and realizes that that's not entirely true. And so having people approach me to have those conversations of what can I do? Who's the CEO of a company? What can my company do? I've been really excited by it.
Yeah, I think a lot of men want to know how they can be included. It's just, what's interesting is, back to that gendered experience, like it's really hard for humans to understand what they haven't lived themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And so for a man that hasn't faced gender bias and discrimination in a negotiation process that was, not, getting an adverse reaction or not getting weird feedback, or in your case, walked out, I think for them, it's like, oh, does that really happen? And so having a vantage point from a daughter or a partner or just any woman in your life, like compare notes. So men, if you're listening, ask women, and don't burden them with educating you on this. Do your own research first, but ask, compare notes with other women in your life and be like, hey, have you ever negotiated? Like, have you ever spoke up or asked for something? And like, what has been the reaction? And just listen to what they have to say, because it's all too common an experience that women face, they don't talk about, they keep it, kind of harbored inside, and it eats away at them. But I think if more men could create like an empathy bridge to that gendered experience that women have, that, hey, they're the decision makers. Like when women go to negotiate, who are they negotiating with? Right?
Yeah.
If only we had more empathy in the conversation, like had that vantage point. So I wonder, Kathryn, like, how do we get them to get it? Like, what if they don't have a daughter, which is not a requirement for an allyship?
I do a management training program. It's just a workshop. It's like a 3-hour experience, right? Where we share a lot of these gender dynamics. And then I do not recommend solutions to my clients, but I create the space for them to come up with solutions that work for them, right? And so there was one person that always stands out to me, and his name is Bob, because like, obviously that was his name, right? So Bob afterwards came to me and he was like, I realized that all of my best opportunities for my team were going to men, because they were the ones coming to me and saying, hey, I heard we just landed X account. I want to be on it. He was like, I thought it meant that they cared more. I did not realize that they just had access to that information. And so now his policy is that whenever somebody comes to him, he says, thanks so much. As you know, the policy is we announce it in our Tuesday weekly meeting, and you have 24 hours to email me if you're interested. And he was like, and now we actually have kind of 50-50 on those opportunities, but my clients are getting a much better experience because now they've been landed with the account manager who actually is the best fit for that client, not just the one who heard about it first.
Yeah, not just the one that spoke up. The loudest voice, the person in the know and always on, is not always the best worker. But it goes back to that notion, I think, of that ideal worker. always there, always available, always responding to emails, like never, putting work before personal life. And for women, I think that's just sadly not their reality. 70% of women are primary caregivers in the US. And so if that's the case, then you don't have all the ample free time to be privy to all the new information, right? And what I love about the Bob story is he figured a systemic way to approach the challenge. And that's what I think we really need, is to fix our systems, to keep asking individual people to speak up, raise your hand, use this strategy. It's kind of fleeting if in the face of that, you have systems that are broken. So I wonder, Kathryn, like, what systems could be addressed to make negotiation more equitable?
Well, we know from the research that women negotiate at equal proportion to men when they're told that there's a negotiable opportunity. So, stage one, every job offer should either all be negotiable and say we're negotiable, or all not negotiable, right? But let's put that on the same thing. The other thing is, and there's a reason why I spend all my time doing this, right? But I do believe that giving women a negotiation as a tool is really important, and as a gender specific tool, right? Not giving you a tool bag of things that are just going to end up like backfiring on you, but giving you gender specific ways to have these conversations that recognize that negotiation, it's not a one-time conversation. It's not, I'm going to negotiate this one time in my career. This is a career skill, the same way as networking or communications or anything else, right? And so giving women the opportunity to have that skill in a gender specific way that we know will set them up to be more successful and minimize backlash, like that, I think, because then top-down programs are great. Top-down programs are great, and they are part of the solution, but they will never recognize the difference between what I need and what you need, or what you need now versus what you needed 5 years ago or in 5 years, right? The only way to have that bottom-up change is to give women the tools to do it and give managers the recognition of the dynamics that exist around those conversations, which is why in a lot of our trainings, we train the women and we have the management training for the managers, because when you can educate both sides of that conversation, that's when the unlock really happens. And it's so fun to see women start getting promoted at higher rates, not because they weren't capable, but because they weren't being recognized. And all
you're just not getting the most from your talent. Like, I think about it that way. It's like, why wouldn't you want to get more out of your team? Like, why are we holding people back unintentionally or sometimes intentionally? Like, what if we could have a conversation openly, and all of that psychological safety and trust building that comes from a negotiated conversation too? I know when I've negotiated with people in the past, I usually feel like much more trust coming out of that, because it's a hard-ish conversation. It's like, well, if we did that, shoot, what else could we do together? And that makes a high-performing team.
It's actually a great way to showcase leadership skills when you do it collaboratively with some of these other tools. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's, inherently what you would want from a good leader. You'd want them to do that with their clients, the people that are faced. Why not internally too? Such a thought-provoking conversation, Kathryn. So thankful for your wisdom today. What is one thing, if you could pick one thing we haven't talked about, or one thing you'd want our audience to take away about negotiation and the power and importance of it, what might one thing be?
The one thing I would say, and this is kind of my homework assignment, right, is for anyone that wants to learn more, if you go to worthmorenegotiations.com, at the top, there's a button that says download, and you can download our list of 75 things that we've seen women negotiate. And what I'm seeing, and I love to see, is I see women download that list just for extra ideas, right? But I also see managers download that list of what else is it that I should bring to the table when I'm giving new offers or in conversations with my team members, to make sure that my team is able to fully contribute what they're capable of. So that would be the one that I would say.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Worthmorenegotiation.com. Did I get that right?
Worthmore Negotiations. Yeah. S.com.
S.com. Okay, listeners. So check that out. I love that as a tangible next step. So, because a lot of times, just like in your negotiation story that you shared at the top, was you spent a whole weekend preparing, right? Like, what if you'd had a guide like that to help prep you? So think about those as prompts just to get your head around it. I think negotiation is such a mental preparation thing to be in the right mindset and have thought through all the things. So those triggers or those thoughts in your guide will be super helpful. So listeners, definitely check that out. Kathryn, what other ways can our listeners connect with you and follow your work?
Oh, I would love it if you connected with me on LinkedIn. That is the only social media site that I'm on.
Yeah, no, I've like really like the most effective one is for DEI. Like there's so much content out there. I find the same thing.
Yeah, it's great. So I'd love it if you connected with me there. And then again, the website is a great place to go for additional resources. We have a free course on how to negotiate as a woman. So if you're a woman that's thinking about this and you don't happen to work for a corporation that we're currently working with, sign up for that email list. The second email you get will have a free 45-minute course in it. So there's all kinds of good resources on that website.
Oh, I love that. What a great marketing idea. I love that. Like get people an appetite for this and get people free resources. So listeners, that's a lot of content she's given you. Check it out. And hopefully your organization will continue to support this conversation too. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for being with us. It was such a pleasure.
Julie, it has been wonderful getting to chat with you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you are on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our brand new Lead Like an Ally online program or get a copy of our new book, Allyship in Action, available on Amazon. Both are helpful tools that meet leaders where they're at and help provide tools for professional and personal settings. Head over to nextpivotpoint.com to get started today.